you both have mentioned the words of Jesus. The Beatitudes in particular. Uh, Really, I'm really interested in this this correlation you made with the Song of Solomon, and you were tuned in to see something that I haven't heard before that relates to this topic. And this one passage of scripture, actually just hearing it sometimes really touches me, from Matthew 11:28 through 30, where Jesus says, "Come to me, all you that are weary and are carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." And that seems to me like this call to self-care. And when Dr. Headley, when you say they've got nothing to serve from, not in those exact words, but I think about how Commissioner Rader was saying Jesus went in a boat. Jesus went up to the mountain. Jesus was filling himself and making sure that he was full for the sake of others. Now, when I hear about self-care and other conversations about self-care, I feel like sometimes it's like knocking a ping pong ball between self-indulgence or inappropriate self-denial or self-deprivation. Let's not say self-denial is a bad word now. Let's not make a list of all these big.
I would agree with you. Yeah.
But self-deprivation versus self-indulgence, and it is self-care on that continuum, or maybe you have to escape that continuum in order to make sense of where it belongs.
I just want to refer to what Dr. Headley said about the Wesleyans and the holiness movement. I found this quote from Commissioner Bringle, who is our holiness king of holiness in Salvation Army. But anyway, I thought it was very interesting. He had in the book that puts together his writings in devotional style, there was one on self-care, which I found very interesting. And he said this. He said, and it refers to what you were just saying, Isaiah, that he says, take the best possible care of your bodies, yet without coddling and petting and pitying yourselves. The body is the instrument through which the mind and the soul work in this world. That's what we we're just saying. Live simply and regularly, get enough sleep, but not too much sleep. Exercise, work heartily, but don't work or exercise yourself to death. Eat, but don't overeat, but don't starve yourself to death either. And, my dad was an evangelist, and he had to eat in a lot of people's homes, and he wanted to make them feel good by eating their food. But he set up this plan for himself so that he could live, and he lived to be 94. And then he was in an automobile accident. So, he said, I don't pack my stomach. When he knew he was full, he pushed away from the table. He didn't eat anymore. And so his kind of mantra was, don't pack, push back. Okay, I think that's a good
Never heard that before.
motto. But it kept him going. And then, the Apostle Paul said, let your moderation be known to all. And I think that's something we have to remember as well. Some things work for some people better than others. And some things work for those who have a wonderful self-esteem. And people who don't have a wonderful self-esteem find it very difficult to stand up for themselves, to think of themselves as worthy. I was listening to another webinar yesterday, and this young man was saying that he tells his children every day that they're worthy, they're good. My daughter was working with a girl in high school here in Kentucky, and the girl had cut into her arm a W. And she said, what is that? And this girl said, my mother tells me every day I'm worthless. And so my daughter said, well, I'll tell you what, we're going to tell you every day that you're worthy, and you're worthy in God's sight. But there are people like that, and we have to remember those people as well as, all the ones who have good self-esteem. But there is balance. I do believe in balance. I did read somewhere where the person said, I'm not so much for balance as rhythm. But if you lean too far to one side, the tightrope walker has a balance stick, a balance rod, and they make sure they keep that balance going. And it is important, but again, I say it has to be intentional. I cannot believe you just quoted from Matthew 11, 28 and 29, because I had those in my mind as well. Another one is I read in the Eugene Peterson paraphrase of Psalm 23, and I love this paraphrase of that psalm. He says, God, my shepherd, I don't need a thing. You have bedded me down in lush meadows. You find me quiet pools to drink from. True to your word, you let me catch my breath and send me in the right direction. And I think that's, a word for all of us who, as you say, Dr. Headley, we begin thinking about others, and pretty soon we're not thinking about ourselves at all. And we're thinking selfish all the time. I, as you just said, I have tried to stand up for the rights of women around the world. And one of the things I've run into with that effort is people, when it comes to women, they didn't want me to say that we should give women recognition. They said that is selfish to have them wanting recognition. Well, they need recognition for the things that they do, just like, all genders need recognition. And so I did not see that as pushing selfishness.
Yeah.
I think
it wasn't
building up their self-esteem.
Right. It was people building others up. It wasn't a matter of self-esteem.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I see Dr. Headley jumping at the bit.
I was going to say, I was thinking about the question that you asked about where does self-care lie on this continuum. I would say that self-care is very consistent with self-denial. I don't think that simply because someone is engaging in self-care that it means that they can't deny themselves. I actually think that self-care is a kind of expression of loving ourselves the way I think God says that we ought to love. But any of us that are parents know that one can love oneself, but yet then you're constantly denying yourself for the sake of your kids. Yeah. So I don't think that those things are mutually exclusive. Yeah. One of the things that I try to do, because I know people struggle with the whole idea of self, is I try to build some biblical bases for self-care. And one of the places that I started was actually with the creation narrative. To think about how does God go about creating? And what does the creation narrative say about who we are as human beings? Well, for one, we're good, okay? God created us and he said it's very good. So there's something very valuable about us that God treasures. I also think about, when I think about the creation narrative, I often think that one of the roles that God is playing is as host, H-O-S-T. And he's preparing a world that is hospitable to his coming guests, which is us. And so I think that if God is willing and in fact intentional about creating a hospitable world for us, we are not partnering with him, we are not imaging him if we create inhospitable environments for ourselves. Now, I know that while doing ministry that there's some inevitable hardships, but I don't think that it is consistent for us to create our own hardships. Let the ones that naturally come from being engaged in the gospel, let them come. But we don't do that by neglecting ourselves and pretending like we are unimportant.
Yeah.
So Genesis has taught me a lot about that. So I often spend some attention also thinking about, how does God work in Genesis? Well, if you follow Brueggemann and many other commentators, God is a God who works and rests. And then I think he says to us, image me in that ability to work and rest.
Yeah.
And so God himself is modeling for us.
Yeah.
And so why would we not follow that model?
Yeah. I'm getting some words that are clashing together and complementing and chorusing here. I'm thinking of this question: can you have spiritual growth without self-denial? If spiritual growth is a part of self-care, can you grow spiritually without some measure of self-denial in that mix? You know, and that kind of goes along with what you're saying about how self-denial and self-care are not exclusive or contradictory. And so, you know, we don't have to think of them as in contradiction to one another. And I wonder, on the other side of that, can service to others also nourish us in some way? Or is that in some way codependent? I mean, then you've maybe got another continuum of like codependency to, you know, just isolating yourself, or disassociation from your ministry. Is, you know, what's the balance between needing your ministry in order to validate yourself and who you are versus allowing God through your ministry to nourish your own soul? Is there a place for that? Or
I'm thinking, as you were talking about that, I was thinking about Jesus and the woman of Samaria, and, you know, talking with her. Obviously, he was very tired, the Bible tells us, and that's why he ended up there, to rest. And the disciples went off to get food. Obviously, they were hungry. And I would imagine Jesus was hungry as well. But in the end, after he had ministered to this woman and talked with her, his word was, I have meat to eat that you know not of. And I feel like that statement says that ministering to people feeds us, even sometimes physically. It's so fulfilling and such a blessing to us to see God work in other people's lives, that we don't feel like we need to eat now. You know, we can do without, and it's not a great burden. And I think we see that in a lot of different scriptures where Jesus, you know, he felt the virtue go out of him, but he was moved then to go on to the very next person. And I mean, I know Jesus is God, and some people say, well, I'm not God. But we are made in the image of God. And I think that the same thing happens to us. I have, in my own personal life, I have felt energized when I had almost dreaded the situation before it happened. But I had felt energized by the ministering to people. The fear of the unknown sometimes enters in, and we become kind of debilitated by that, and we shrink back. But he gives us the energy. He energizes us through ministry. I really believe that. So
yeah, on the one hand, you know, we are created in the image of God. On the other hand, he gives us his own spirit to empower what we do. And let me get Dr. Headley also to chime in on that. What about, you know, can ministry nourish us, and when does that become codependent and unhealthy?
Well, I would say yes. And I'm thinking here about Wesley and his emphasis on the acts of piety and works of mercy. Both of those are legitimate things that Christians ought to engage in. And when he talks about acts of piety, of course, he's talking about those things that nourish our own soul, like engaging in prayer and Bible reading and the like. And that, I think, is in many ways foundational for our own spiritual lives. But Wesley also would emphasize the need to minister to other people, which would involve acts of mercy. And so both of those have a place in the life of the Christian. And I think that they complement each other. Yeah, I think that something can happen when we are ministering to others. Invariably, I've found, for instance, like when I counsel with persons, that there's something, even though I'm focusing on them, there's something that transpires in that session that has a way of illuminating me. So there's something that comes about as a matter of course when I'm engaging someone else. At the same time, I think it is that I cannot depend on my ministry to others to be my sole source of food.
Wow.
I think about it as kind of like getting crumbs from the table. I want a full meal. And that means that I have to engage the spiritual disciplines. I have to engage my body, my soul, my mind for myself. And that is more like a full course meal. Whereas I think that if we are simply depending on ministry to others as a way of feeding our own souls, I think we're going to come up short. Now, as I said, I do believe that something real happens and it really impacts us. I don't know that it is sufficient. And so sometimes when I'm speaking, I differentiate between personal spirituality and professional spirituality. Professional spirituality is engaging the spiritual disciplines, whether prayer or scripture reading, in my public ministry. You know, like when I get up in the pulpit and I read scripture or I pray. And that's good. But if I don't have a place in my own life for private prayer, private reading of scripture, I'm going to eventually become malnourished. So yes, I think that it can lend something to ourselves, but I don't know that I would say that on its own it's sufficient to nourish us fully as we need to be nourished.